Today in this video, we are going to be talking about the Tiananmen Square protest. What happened, important events that happened among the protest, important figures within the protest, and the after effects. And I'll now be passing you on to Talia.
In 1989, thousands of students marched in Tiananmen Square in Beijing to peacefully protest for political reform, freedom of speech, and the end of corruption in government. Encouraged by growing calls for democracy, the movement soon gained support from workers and other citizens. As the protests grew, the Chinese government declared martial law and on June 4th sent troops into the square to violently disperse the protesters. Troops and tanks with guns opened fire on weaponless civilians, slaughtering them in the terrible massacre. The Chinese government has since attempted to suppress discussion of the incident, and nobody is quite sure how many were killed. Estimates of the death toll vary from several hundred to several thousands, but the actual number is unknown due to the government's strict censorship and its refusal to release its records. All mention of the massacre has been cut out from the Chinese media, textbooks, and internet in the years since, and anyone attempting to commemorate the event is arrested and harassed. Despite this, the image of one man standing in front of the line of tanks, known as Tank Man, has become an international iconic symbol of resistance to oppression. The Tiananmen Square event is a powerful reminder of the cost of freedom and the continuing struggle for human rights in the face of oppressive authorities.
Following that, we're going to be hearing from Derry talking more about what happened that day and more about the infamous Tank Man.
The demonstration became a forum to protest corruption and inflation in the call for broader political economic reforms. To build on the reforms already transferred in Chinese considerably in the post-Mao era. The Chinese leadership was divided on how to handle the demonstration. Now, to piggyback off of Talia's point of Tank Man, known as the Chinese Communists, the parties ever known as the CCP, the violent crackdown on Tiananmen Square in 1989. What started to be out as a funeral for a political leader by the name of Ho Yao Vong became a large-scale protest that day and against the protest against the Chinese government.
In the course of a brutal government attack on disagreement, Chinese troops opened fire on civilians in Beijing's Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989, killing an undetermined number of unarmed pro-democracy demonstrators and bystanders across the city. In this photo, it shows on June 5th, 1989, near Tiananmen Square, Beijing, a man is standing in front of 4 tanks lined up moving east on Tiananmen Boulevard. This image is by Jeff Winder.
Next, we have a short video from Time talking more about Tank Man and how the image was created.
And all of a sudden, this guy with shopping bags walks out in front, and I'm looking at it, and I get annoyed, and I look at Kirk, and I said, this guy's going to screw up my composition. And he goes, they're going to kill that guy. They're going to kill him. And I looked, and I said, this guy's crazy. You hear gunfire going on everywhere, and the guy doesn't flinch. He just stays there. Not only popped shots from the AK-47s, but there was automatic fire from large caliber you could hear, and he still didn't move. It's just unbelievable how much courage he had to just fight his cause there. When I finally got to the balcony, I took 1, 2, 3 shots, and Kirk says, "Did you get it? Did you get it?" You could say it's David and Goliath, but I think it goes beyond David and Goliath. And here's this guy who is obviously just out shopping, and finally he's just had enough. And he goes out in the street with these oncoming tanks. If he's halfway normal, he thinks he's going to die, but he doesn't care. He just doesn't care because for whatever reason, either he's lost a loved one or he's just had it with the government. For whatever it is, his statement is more important than his own life.
Now introducing Haley to talk about the key figures of leadership and specifically Zhao Ziyang.
The Chinese leadership was during the Tiananmen Square protest and the subsequent massacre in 1989. It was deeply divided, particularly between reformists and hardliners within the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. This division played a major role in how the crisis unfolded. One of the main leaders was Zhao Ziyang, which was the general secretary of the CCP reformists. He was sympathetic to the student protesters and believed in engaging them through dialogue rather than force. He pushed for political reform and a more open approach to handling the unrest. Zhao opposed declaring martial law and using military force. Ultimately, his position cost him his career. He was purged from the party shortly after the crackdown and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Despite being removed from political power, Zhao remained a symbol of conscience and reform force among numerous Chinese citizens and descendants. His passive resistance and refusal to withdraw his stance on the Tiananmen protest earned him both foreign and domestic praise. During his years of house arrest, he remained closely watched and rarely allowed outside contact. His writing and thoughts during this period were finally smuggled out and published posthumously, yielding little insight into the inner struggles of the Chinese leadership during one of the country's most turbulent eras. Zhao's legacy remains as a reminder of the cost of standing by principle in defiance of authoritarianism.
This picture of Xiao Zhang was posted alongside an article talking about how he was finally able to have been buried after a long fight with the Chinese government. His family was finally able to put his body and their mother's body to rest after years of his name being erased and censored from any media. As well, there was a small post, you could say, referencing his actions from the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, saying that he, quote, made some small errors, referencing him siding with the protesters and wanting to be that voice, as Haley mentioned in the section prior. Now here's Hannah for a small overview of the after effects from the Tiananmen Square protest.
In the aftermath, a sweeping campaign was launched. Information about the protest was erased from public discourse, and to this day, it remains one of the most heavily censored topics in China. The government imposed strict controls on the media and the internet, effectively silencing discussions and punishing dissent. The official narrative remains that the protests were a riot, a threat to national stability that had to be stopmed. Although the students' calls for reform briefly sparked international discussions within the government, no substantial political changes followed. The hoped-for reforms, greater transparency, democratic participation, and end to corruption were never realized. The political system remained and still remains largely unchanged. However, the Tiananmen Square protests left a mark on the world globally. They altered perceptions of the Chinese government and influenced the diplomatic and economic policies of many nations. The protests exposed a strong undercurrent of public desire for political change, one that, while repressed, has not been forgotten.
To add on to Hannah's point of what the after effects of the Tiananmen Square protests were, there are multiple things that followed. She mentioned the political repression, the censorship and silencing, the economics, the international relations, and the global perception, as well as the human rights perspective of it. I'm going to be diving a little deeper into each of these topics. To start with, political repression. Right after the incident in Tiananmen Square, the Chinese government went into pretty much a lockdown mode. Not in a physical way, but more in a political way, where thousands of those people that weren't killed were arrested. Reform-minded officials, those who were backing the reform at the time, such as Zhao Ziyang, had shown sympathy for those protesters that were participating in the Tiananmen Square protest. Those people, like Zhao Ziyang, were purged from the CCP. They were removed in a manner so they could no longer have an influence on the Chinese government. Next, the leadership didn't just want to squash the protests, get rid of them. They wanted to use the protests as an example for future protestees who might have an idea of doing something similar. In the book Beyond Tiananmen, Swettinger points out that it wasn't just a reaction, but quotes that the government leaned harder on the military and internal security to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. On to censorship and silencing. They started erasing the memory of the Tiananmen Square protest, as in getting rid of any records of it from any source that you could find in China. There were no books, no media, no news outlets. Everything regarding the topic was completely erased. So when anyone who would ever try to find anything out about it, they wouldn't be able to. But it wasn't just the Tiananmen Square protest. They started erasing a lot of things that they didn't want the people to know. So you'd search for something online and you wouldn't find it because the Chinese government would make it so that it wouldn't necessarily exist. So Reporters Without Borders tracked down how the silencing has even spread to places like Hong Kong, which was near China, where vigils were once held freely. Now those things are banned. So again, in Beyond Tiananmen, Suringer calls it a strategic amnesia, a kind of forced forgetting designed to protect the government's image and grip on power. Now to get into the economic side. There was a economic reform plan in China that was going underway until the Tiananmen protest happened, which put a halt on that plan. But that halt or that stoppage did not last for very long because the government quickly made a deal with its people, saying such as they would make the people wealthier, more rich, if they were to stay out of the politics or the political landscape in China. So what followed that return to its economic reform was a shift to state-controlled capitalism, which did end up helping China's economics by increasing their growth economically and increasing incomes, as long as those people were to stay out of politics. So Swettinger from Beyond Tiananmen described this as a tactical pivot using prosperity as a pressure release valve to avoid the risk of future uprisings, much as I mentioned in the first section of political repression. So, to get along with that, there was less political freedom, but more economic growth. Now, to get on to the international relations side of it, Tiananmen protest didn't just change China from the inside, it changed China from the outside. Many countries, such as US and most of Europe, responded with sanctions because of how China undertook the protest. There were frozen talks on certain subjects. There was public condemnation from a lot of countries' diplomats. And a lot of the diplomatic relationships between China and other countries came to a standstill. So Swettinger from Beyond Tiananmen shows how it shifted the U.S.-China relationship from a cautious partnership to mutual suspicion. Both sides became more reactive, more defensive, and despite eventual trade deals and reopened communication, that sense of mistrust never really went away. Finally, the global perception and the human rights side of the protest. To a lot of the world, the protest became a symbol for human rights, but also a brutal reminder of what authoritarian governments or regimes are willing to do or are able to do to stay in power. A lot of human rights organizations still fight to make sure that Tiananmen protest isn't forgotten by anyone, despite China's efforts to erase it from history. Swettinger says this legacy is a central challenge in modern U.S.-China relations. Every time the West pushes China on democracy or human rights, the government pushes back even harder, seeing it as an interference, not justice. Summarizing the after effects one more time in a quick and easy, simple way. The political repression basically shut down the reform at that time and made it so the people were less involved within the political landscape. Then with the censorship and silencing, they grew stricter on what they censored and what they took away from the media and what was available to the people. When it came to that economics, the economic standpoint, China was booming with growth. However, they used it as an excuse to get people out of politics. And for international relations, a lot of people shifted away from China, and a lot of people condemned them for what had happened on that day. And global perception, as well as those human rights, it's still used today as a major standpoint when it comes to human rights activists and what shouldn't happen under any circumstances to any group of people.